The estate of São Miguel do Vale stretched across the hills like a sleeping giant, its whitewashed walls gleaming under the relentless Brazilian sun. To 8-year-old Helena Ambrosio de Lima, daughter of Colonel Ambrosio and Dona Almarinda, the world was a puzzle of boundaries she didn't yet understand. There was the Casa Grande, the big house, with its cool, tiled floors and hushed conversations. There were the formal gardens where she practiced her curtsy, and then there was the world beyond the kitchen yard, the endless coffee fields, the shaded mango grove, and the row of low clay-tiled buildings everyone called the senzala, the slave quarters. It was there, one sweltering afternoon when the air smelled of ripe fruit and damp earth, that she first truly saw him. A boy, perhaps a year or two older than her, was struggling with a wooden bucket nearly as tall as his chest. Water sloshed over the rim with each unsteady step, darkening the red dust. His arms trembled with the strain, but his face was set in a mask of fierce concentration. Helena, having slipped away from her nanny, watched from behind the trunk of a mango tree. She'd seen enslaved people before. Of course, they were the backdrop to her life, moving like quiet ghosts through the house and fields. But she'd never watched one. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed her lessons on propriety, she stepped out from her hiding place. The boy froze, his dark eyes widening. He quickly lowered his gaze as had been taught. "Doesn't that hurt?" Helena asked, her voice cutting through the heavy afternoon silence. The boy kept his head down, but his shoulders stiffened. A long moment passed. Helena thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice soft as rustling leaves, he said, "The bucket hurts my hands, Sinhazinha, but it hurts less when someone sees it." Helena blinked. No one had ever spoken to her with such quiet, unadorned truth. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, as if they'd made an agreement. "I see it," she whispered. That was the beginning. His name was Tobias. Their worlds were not meant to intersect, but childhood has a way of tunneling under walls. Helena's appointed playmates were the dull daughters of other planters, their games confined to the veranda. Tobias' childhood had ended almost before it began, his days filled with fetching, carrying, and tending. Yet, in the liminal spaces of the estate, the forgotten corner behind the corn shed, the edge of the orchard where the overseer's eye seldom reached, they found cracks in the system that bound them. The whistle was Tobias' idea. He was trying to mimic the call of a sabia bird that kept taunting him from the roof of the senzala. The sound came out thin and wavering. Helena, crouched nearby, giggled. The sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that Tobias forgot himself and smiled. "Can you teach me?" she asked. He hesitated, a lifetime of warnings flashing in his eyes. But she was just a girl, and the afternoon was long. Shyly he showed her how to curl her tongue, how to shape her lips, how to let the air pass through just so. Her first attempts were breathy failures. They laughed together, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the estate. In that shared, imperfect melody, a bond was sealed. As the years turned, the stolen moments continued. When Helena began her writing lessons with her mother, she would smuggle charcoal and scraps of paper to their hiding place. Under the pretense of playing school, she taught Tobias to trace the letters of his name. He learned with a reverence that moved her deeply, his rough fingers carefully forming the shapes that represented a self the world tried to deny. "Tobias," she sounded out. "Tobias," he repeated, the word tasting of dignity on his tongue. Love, when it came, did not arrive with thunderclaps or dramatic declarations. It grew as quietly as moss on the north side of a tree. It was in the glance he allowed himself when no one else was looking, a quick, warm meeting of eyes that said, "I am here." It was in the piece of guava she left on the bench by the spring, and the way he would wait until she was gone before taking it, holding the sweet fruit like a treasure. It was in the unspoken understanding that in each other's presence they were not Sinhazinia and Escravo, but Helena and Tobias. But the estate was an organism with 1,000 eyes. The colonel noticed his daughter's too frequent absences and the strange, thoughtful silence that had replaced her childish chatter. Doña Almarinda sighed over Helena's dirt-stained hems and her lack of interest in lace and pianofortes. Among the enslaved community, older women like Joanna, Tobias' mother, watched with a heavy heart. She saw the tenderness in her son's eyes when the young mistress passed, and she knew the world had no room for such a look. "That path leads to a cliff, my son," Joanna whispered to him one night as she mended a shirt. "You cannot fly. You will only fall." Tobias listened, but his heart, once awakened, could not be reasoned with. Helena, for her part, felt the walls of her gilded cage tightening. She began to understand the architecture of her life. She was a vessel for her family's legacy, a piece to be moved on a strategic board. The freedom she felt with Tobias was the only real thing in a world of polished falsehoods. The storm began with a letter and a visit. Colonel Ambrosio received news that the neighboring estate, Santa Fe, was in financial difficulty. Its owner, the proud but desperate Senor Augusto Velasco, saw a solution in alliance. The colonel saw expansion. Over brandy and cigars in the study, while Helena eavesdropped with a cold knot in her stomach, they bartered not just land and credit, but her future. "My Helena is of age," the colonel said, his voice booming with false heartiness. "A virtuous girl, obedient. She will make your son a fine wife." The deal was struck. Helena was summoned. The announcement was delivered not as a question, but as a fact. She was to marry young Augusto Velasco, a man she knew only as a loud, red-faced presence at holiday masses, in 4 months' time. That night, Helena's world shattered. She flung herself at her mother's feet in the opulent sitting room, tears carving paths through her powder. "May, please, I do not know him. I do not love him. I cannot." Doña Almarinda's face, usually a mask of serene composure, flickered with something ancient and weary. She stroked her daughter's hair, but her words were iron. "Love is not for women like us, Mina Filha. It is a luxury for poets and fools. Our duty is to strengthen our family, to ensure its survival. You will accept. You will be a good wife. In time you may even find contentment." Contentment. The word tasted like ash. Helena left the room, her future a long, dark corridor closing in around her. The order came down to the overseer, Antonio Antao Peixoto, a man of brute force and narrow conscience. Tobias was to be reassigned to the far fields. He was no longer to work near the house. The young mistress was not to be disturbed. The separation was a physical agony. For Helena, the house became a museum of absence. Every room echoed with memories of a shared glance, a suppressed laugh. For Tobias, sent to the brutal sun of the coffee fields, the world lost its color. The weight of the sack on his back was nothing compared to the weight of the silence that now stood between him and the only light he had ever known. The stage was set. The players were in position, and the great unfeeling machine of tradition and power began to grind toward the wedding day, unaware of the human heart's terrible, defiant power to resist. The 4 months until the wedding passed in a blur of stifling preparation for Helena, and in a haze of back-breaking labor and silent despair for Tobias. The Casa Grande was transformed into a hive of activity, but for Helena it felt like the construction of her own tomb. Seamstresses from the city arrived, their mouths full of pins as they fitted her for a gown of Brussels lace and Irish linen. The fabric was exquisite, but under her touch it felt as cold and heavy as chainmail. Her mother presented her with a jewelry box containing the family heirlooms she would wear, heavy gold bracelets, a necklace of Portuguese diamonds, earrings that pulled at her lobes. "This is the wealth of our name, Helena. Wear it with pride," Doña Almarinda instructed. Helena only felt the weight. Meanwhile, she became a ghost in her own home. She moved through the festivities, the engagement dinner, the visits from distant relatives, with a polite, vacant smile. She was praised for her newfound serenity and maturity. Little did they know that her stillness was not compliance, but the stillness of a rabbit caught in a snare, conserving its last strength. She managed only one more encounter with Tobias. It was by accident, or perhaps by some stubborn fate. She had wandered to the old spring, a place thick with memories. He was there, collecting water for the field hands, his frame leaner, his eyes shadowed. They stared at each other across 20 paces of sun-dappled ground, a canyon carved by law and custom. No words were safe. The overseer or a house slave could appear at any moment. But as Tobias turned to lift the yoke onto his shoulders, his eyes met hers. In them, she didn't see resignation. She saw a deep, smoldering grief, and beneath it, a love so steadfast it stole her breath. He gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. "I am still here. I remember." That look became her secret fuel. It was the ember she nursed in the frozen landscape of her impending marriage. The wedding day dawned impossibly bright and clear. The chapel on the estate was decorated with white orchids and sweet-smelling jasmine. The air vibrated with the discordant tunes of a band brought from town. The guests, planters in stiff suits, ladies in silks fanning themselves, filled the pews, their faces masks of celebration. Helena walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She saw none of it. In her mind, she was walking through the mango grove, the smell of wet earth in her nostrils, the sound of a failed whistle in her ears. She reached the altar. Standing there was Augusto Velasco. Up close, he was younger than she remembered, but his expression was one of smug satisfaction, as if head won a prized horse. His hand, when it took hers, was damp. The priest's words washed over her like a foreign language. "Do you, Helena Ambrosia de Lima? Take this man, I do," she heard herself say, the voice thin and far away. The celebration at the Casa Grande was riotous. Tables groaned under roast-suckling pigs, pyramids of fruit, and cascades of wine. Augusto held court, his laughter too loud, his backslapping too hearty. He drank heavily, toasting his new father-in-law, his own fortune, his beautiful bride. He treated Helena as another acquisition, proudly showing her off but rarely speaking to her. As the night wore on, a deep, reckless resolve hardened within Helena. If this was to be her life, she would have one last taste of truth. When the silver tray of champagne glasses passed, she took one, then another. The bubbles were sharp and bitter. The alcohol spread through her veins, not bringing warmth, but dissolving the last of her fear. It unlocked a floodgate of memory, Tobias' shy smile, the feel of charcoal on paper, the protective curve of his shoulder as he showed her how to hold a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. Across the room, Augusto was succumbing to his own indulgence. He staggered, slurred a joke that fell flat, and was eventually supported by 2 servants as Colonel Ambrosio looked on with thinly veiled disgust. "Take him to his room," the colonel muttered. "Let him sleep it off." The party, slightly dampened, continued. Helena watched her husband being led away, a puppet with cut strings. This was the man to whom she belonged. This was the rest of her life. An hour later, she stood outside the door to the marital bedroom. Inside, she could hear the ragged sound of Augusto's drunken snore. The hallway was empty, the sounds of the party now a distant murmur. A single candle flickered on a console table, its flame dancing in the draught. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. The wine hummed in her head, whispering courage. She thought of her mother's resigned eyes, her father's transactional pride, Augusto's possessive grip. She thought of Tobias' nod at the spring. Silently, she turned away from the bedroom door. She moved like a sleepwalker through the quiet house, out a side door, and into the velvety embrace of the night. The cool air was a shock on her skin. She gathered her heavy skirts and began to run, not toward freedom. She knew true freedom was an illusion, but toward the only truth she had ever possessed. The slave quarters were dark, save for a few faint glows behind shutters. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stopped before a familiar door. For a moment she wavered. This was madness. This was danger of the highest order. To turn back was safety, was survival. But what was survival without a soul? Her hand, trembling violently, rose. She knocked 3 times, pause, 2 times. It was their old signal, from a time when their biggest worry was being caught skipping lessons. The silence inside was absolute. Had he been moved? Was he asleep? Had he forgotten? Then the softest scrape of wood. The door opened a crack, and Tobias' face appeared, etched in shadow and moonlight. His eyes held not surprise, but a profound, weary recognition, as if he had been waiting for this knock his entire life. "Helena." His voice was a hoarse whisper, filled with more emotion than any shouted declaration. The dam broke. "They've taken everything, Tobias," she choked out. "But they can't have this, not tonight." He looked past her into the night, his mind surely calculating the risks, the certain punishment. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the wedding dress glowing eerily in the dark. He saw the girl who had seen his pain, who had taught him his name. With a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the door wider. Tobias and Helena share a final, poignant moment in his small room, a conversation of whispered regrets, shared memories, and a love acknowledged too late. It is a meeting of souls, not bodies, charged with tragedy. Meanwhile, Augusto wakes, disoriented and thirsty. Finding his bride gone, a jealous suspicion curdles his drunken fog. He stumbles through the house, his rage growing, until a housemaid's fearful glance toward the cinzala gives him direction. He storms across the yard, bursting into Tobias' room to find them together, not in sin, but in a heartbreaking tableau of farewell. His roar of betrayal shatters the night. The estate erupts. Augusto drags Tobias into the main yard, screaming accusations. The family and guests are roused. Colonel Ambrosio is paralyzed by shame, Doña Almarinda by horror. Overseer Antao, sensing an opportunity to prove his zeal, seizes Tobias and chains him to the whipping post. Helena, transformed from a passive victim into a fury, fights Antao, throwing herself between him and Tobias. In front of the entire assembled estate, she shouts her truth. "I love him. I was forced to marry. The only sin here is yours." Her public confession creates a seismic shift. The crowd is stunned into silence. Augusto's fury meets an unexpected wall, his own crumbling authority and the undeniable power of her honesty. A long, tense standoff ensues as dawn approaches. Augusto, humiliated and stripped of his righteous anger by Helena's confession, is caught between societal expectation and a dawning, horrified conscience. He orders the punishment to proceed, but his voice lacks conviction. As Antao raises the whip, Augusto staggers, turns, and walks away into the fading darkness. The next morning, a letter is found. In it, Augusto declares he cannot live with the shame, nor can he be the instrument of punishing the innocent you force to sin. He renounces the marriage and leaves the estate, with no master to give the order. Antao is forced to unchain Tobias. The victory is hollow, fragile, and costly. In the aftermath, Helena is ostracized by her family and class. She chooses exile from the Casa Grande, moving to a small, humble house on the edge of the estate property. Tobias, though technically still enslaved, exists in a precarious limbo. The colonel, broken by the scandal, cannot bear to look at him. Months later, Dona Almerinda visits Helena's cottage. Wordlessly, she takes off her own wedding ring and places it in her daughter's hand, a silent apology and acknowledgement of her courage. This act of grace allows Helena and Tobias, with the colonel's tacit and weary permission, to leave São Miguel do Vale forever. They walk down the dirt road at dawn, carrying nothing but their shared history and a future they will now write for themselves, step by step, away from the shadows of the mango grove. If this story of forbidden love and quiet resilience touched your heart, please share this video with someone who appreciates tales of humanity against the odds. Subscribe to Tales of Slavery for more poignant historical journeys into the forgotten corners of history. Your support helps us keep these important memories alive. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from.